Well, apparently Bushrod can give Shadow Paladin bad support. Yeah.
Stand up! Vanguard!
Hey Cardfighters, welcome back to another Cardfight update, and today we've got some more reveals for the upcoming Clan Selection Plus set, this time Volume 1 once again, and this time we saw the reveals for Shadow Paladin, aka the new Witch's archetype, or should I say new to some extent, and yeah, it is interesting, but it will definitely not be on par of what we came to expect of Shadow Paladin these past few sets that they have been support, as this looks more in the ballpark of Phantom Blaster Dragon Overlord, and maybe even weaker than that. Basically, to understand what I'm referring to, let's talk about these new cards for Shadow Paladin, and then analyze them, what they can do, and how we could potentially use them in a new strategy. Because Shadow Paladin got 3 new cards, which all belong to the new Witch's archetype, and they all revolve around the old interesting mechanic that they do something with Grade Zeros, aka triggers. And the first card that we're going to look at is a new Grade 1, which is Coldblooded Witch Lurba. And her ability is Auto and Rearguard Circle. This ability's cost is reduced by 1 counterblast for each of your opponent's Grade 0 rearguards. When placed, cost counterblast 2, and put a Grade 2 or greater normal unit from your drop zone on the bottom of your deck and draw a card. So this card allows you to put a specific card back into the deck, and this will come up once we look at the other cards, and then it can potentially draw you a card. Now ideally you want to make this counterblast 0, so effectively it allows you to put a certain card back into your deck and then draw a card for free on place, which is pretty nice. Now in the generic sense, this will never come up, because your opponent will most likely not call Grade Zeros to the field, so you need to forcefully put those Grade Zeros onto the field, which we luckily can do with a specific Grade 2. So to understand what Lurba can do, let's take a look at that specific Grade 2. Because that specific Grade 2 is Witch of Reality Femme. And this Grade 2 has the ability Act on Vanguard Circle. Once a turn, costs Soul Blast 1. Your opponent chooses 2 Grade 0 units cards from his or her drop zone and calls them to his or her rearguard circle with Grade 1 or greater units. If no cards were called, this unit gets drive +1 until the end of turn. So effectively it allows you to remove 2 potential units off the field as they are being replaced with Grade 0. So it's somewhat of a retire, but not completely, and depending on what your opponent is playing, this might not be all that significant, because if you're up against a Force Clan, yes, they're now triggers, but if they can stack up Force markers, those triggers will still hit for hard. And if you're up against a clan that could potentially put them into the soul, bounce them back to your hand, or do something else with it, then it might not always come up as often. Now the interesting part about this skill is the fact that you could potentially get a drive check. And in the early game, it effectively is a different Blaster Dark, because Blaster Dark can also gain another drive check on the Vanguard Circle, only that will cost a counterblast, this costs a soul. So depending on the scenario, it might or might not come up. And in the early game, it's most likely that your opponent won't have any rear guards, which allows you to get a drive check, because there are 2 ways how you can acquire this drive check. Either your opponent has no rear guards on the field, thus they cannot call any Grade Zeros onto those units, or 2, they don't have Grade Zeros in a drop zone that they can then call on top of their units. So if either one of those scenarios come up, then this unit will gain an extra drive check. And in the early game, on your Grade 2 turn, it's very likely that they have either no rearguards or they have no Grade Zeros in their drop zone. So pretty interesting in the early game, but in the mid to late game, probably not so much, as we're going to see with the specific Grade 3 support card, or main Grade 3 of the Witch's archetype, which this whole deck will revolve around. Because that new main Grade 3 is Mesmerizing Witch, Fianna. And Fianna has the following 2 abilities. Act on Vanguard Circle. Once a turn, costs counterblast 1 and retire 2 rearguards. Search your deck for up to 1 Witch of Reality Femme, aka the Grade 2, call to the front or rearguard circle, and if you search your deck, shuffle your deck. The circle that called unit is on becomes a Vanguard circle until the end of turn. So this card allows you to search at the Grade 2, and then that Grade 2 becomes a Vanguard unit as well. Which is nice because it allows you to use that Grade 2's ability even in the mid to late game after you already ridden into your Grade 3 turns. Which allows you to have, again, just like Gansalot, have 2 Vanguard swings. One on your original Vanguard circle and one on the side columns, so you have multiple drive checks. And with the grade 2, you could potentially have 2 twin drives. And overall on card advantage, this grade 3 is a wash, because you lose 2 rear guards, but you search at the grade 2, which is 1 card, and then the grade 2 will have at least 1 drive check, which is another card, so you lose 2, you gain 2, it's a wash. Now, if the grade 2 has twin drive, you actually gain card advantage on top of it, which then will compensate for the counterblast cost you need to pay up front. Now, there is of course another layer of this card, because we have a secondary effect, which is continuous Vanguard Circle. During your turn, all of your Vanguards get power plus 5k for each of your opponent's grade 0 rear guards. Now, this is kind of awkward, because yes, it basically allows you to gain more power onto the field if you combine it with the grade 2, but that means you don't get the drive check, because this basically tells us that we want to get those 2 units onto the field, those 2 grade 0s. And because we get those grade 0s on the field, we don't get that extra drive check with Fem. Now, granted, we do get an extra 10k power buff on our main Vanguard and on the Fem itself, which makes our attacks a bit more stronger, but it will not give us any extra pressure. And once we go into our grade 3 turns, we can basically assume that that grade 2 will never attain that extra drive check, because either our opponent already called multiple cards to the field and only 1 rear guard is more than enough, and they probably already have guarded with a grade 0, or at least your opponent can actively play around this and guard with a grade 0 so you don't get that extra drive check, because you'll probably gain more value out of the drive check than actually needing to call that grade 0 onto the field. Now, another issue with Fianna is, of course, if we run out of them targets, then this card doesn't do anything at all. Now, luckily, the grade 1 does allow us to shuffle back that grade 2 back into the deck, so that's where we can see where the grade 1 comes into play, because her skill is actually to shuffle back the grade 2 back into the deck, so we have a target with Fianna. Only the timing of things can be quite awkward, because if our opponent doesn't have grade 0s onto the field and they can remove them during their turn, and we go into our turn and they have no grade 0s onto the field, and we don't have any Vems in our deck, then we have a bit of a problem, because that means we need to resolve the grade 1, which then costs 2 counterblasts to shovel back the grade 2, and then use this grade 3 skill, which costs another counterblast to actually get that grade 2 onto the field, to then use her skill Soul Blast 1 to then put 2 grade 0s onto the field. And that isn't really good. Now, the main upset to this card to, let's say, Ganslot, for example, because Ganslot and this card do have a lot of similarities, is that unlike Ganslot, Fianna, at the very least, is self-sustaining. She can search out that specific card, which then on the rear guard circle becomes a Vanguard, which then swings with at least 1 drive check. Ganslot is dependent on you either drawing into the Blaster Blade, or in having a searcher for the Blaster Blade. Granted, Royal Paladin can easily search it out, and Ganslot only have to call the Blaster Blade to the field, no matter how we call it, as long as it's on the field. Fianna needs to call Fem via her skill to gain the effect, which can also be kind of awkward. And now the main issue, and probably already can guess what's going on here, is that this deck doesn't really do anything. Like, yes, we can put grade 0s onto the field, and we could have potentially a twin drive rear guard, but both those status conflict with each other, because we don't want to put grade 0s onto the field to gain the twin drive, but if we don't get the grade 0s onto the field, then we don't get the power buff, and our grade 1 doesn't become a free draw card. So skills are conflicting here with each other, which is kind of annoying. And besides that, the deck doesn't really do anything. We have no multi-attacking, we don't have a lot of power gaining, and yes, we are screwing with our opponent's field, but just putting grade 0s into the field from the drop zone doesn't hurt our opponent at all. At least in the old original archetype playstyle of Witches for Shadow Paladin, they could grab the grade 0s from their deck. So they are actually losing triggers from potential drive checks, which is a lot better than just calling them from the drop zone, because some decks in some archetypes gain actual advantage from you doing that to some extent. And if your opponent has no cards onto the field, then this deck doesn't really do anything on it much. Yes, you can potentially gain the extra drive check, but it basically is a balance act between either gaining the extra drive check or gaining value of your cards and more power, which is annoying to some extent, if I'm gonna be very honest. Now, is there potential for this deck? Yeah, there could be potential, because what you can do is you can go all in on the twin drive, double twin drive mechanic, and basically slot this these cards in with a lot of retire skills. So what you're doing is either you're screwing with their field and calling great zeros onto the board, but preferably you just want to remove their entire field, then use this great free skill as it's an active ability, so it can first resolve other skills, then use her skill to then superior call the grade 2, and then gain the twin drive, because you can potentially forcefully activate that skill. Now, it does cost you quite a lot of resources, but there probably are a lot of unplace effects that could potentially retire stuff, aka Blast Dark, and once you used its skill from the unplace effect, it can just become retire fodder for Fianna herself. So there are options and there are playstyles available to this deck, but honestly this looks really, really weak in comparison to other decks that we've seen in the Clan Selection Plus volume, and even worse in comparison to what Shadow Paladin already has access to. But granted, it is an interesting playstyle, which they might give more support later down the line if they feel like it, because I think there is more potential, and hopefully if they're gonna support witches more, they go back to their old roots where they're grabbing triggers from the deck itself, because that's nowhere near overpowered as you might think, and it actually gives some value behind the effects, because you're screwing with your opponent's playstyle and the potential win condition, which is way better than just calling great zeros from the drop zone, which doesn't really conflict with what they're trying to do. So yeah, as of now, Mesmerizing Witch, Fianna, and the Witch archetype doesn't look so hot as we hoped it to be. But at the very least, there are more things to look forward to, because next week they announced we're going to get a couple of cards. But more importantly, we're getting Chaos Breaker Dragon. So 2021 is starting real good. So with that said, let me know in the comments down below what you guys think of these new cards for Shadow Paladin and the Witches. Probably not so much. Probably it's not that hot as we hoped it to be. It's not really that strong. But hey, maybe you like it. Maybe it's your cup of tea. Let me know all your thoughts in the comment section down below. And as for Chaos Breaker Dragon, this is the perfect time to watch my older video, links on top, where I speculate what the potential skill of Chaos Breaker Dragon could be. It's a really fun video. It's a good to watch. If you haven't seen it, links on top, definitely go watch it. 100% plugging my own stuff. And while we're plugging my own stuff, I have to say, it's real weird to now record a video again, because the last time that I recorded a video was a long time ago, maybe a week or so, at least the last Cardfight update, because in the meantime I've been streaming a lot on twitch.tv/MrTimeleap, and going from streaming like 8-9 hours to now recording a video, it's a weird switch if I'm gonna be very honest, but it's something I'm gonna do more often. So if you're interested in more live content where I might be discussing things that we talk about on this channel, or just video game in general, because I'm doing mainly Genshin Impact right now, then definitely check me out on twitch.tv. Now, with that self-promotion shenanigan out of the way, it's time to end the video. This video has been brought to you by our lovely patrons over at patreon.com/VanguardInsider. You guys are amazing. If you do want to support the channel or everything that's happening on the channel, you can simply go to patreon.com/VanguardInsider and become a patron today. But with that said, I'm Mr. Timeleap, and I see you guys in the next one!